Now, we're going to talk about another mistake, another major mistake, and that is doing way too much cardio or doing barely any at all. So first, I want to address the obvious, and that's doing too much cardio. I've worked with this client. I've been this client who does an insane amount of cardio because they just are blinded by this idea that more is better. And realistically, this is going to catch up with them in some form or another. And yes, there are times where, maybe you could make an argument for it, but it's not sustainable. And that's really what this comes down to. And whenever I'm designing someone's program and I'm looking at their weekly amount of cardio, there are clients that I'll use like a set target. So it'll be like, 210 minutes for the week. Or, it'll be more sliding scale. It'll be like 210 to 280. And granted, this is not our starting point for many people, but for some people, this is what we escalate up to. And this is going to make a lot more sense once we go into the client who's doing too little. So hold tight for that. When we look at doing too much cardio, really the amount of cardio in a single session that I think is going to be no longer productive is going to be past 60 minutes. And is that a hard rule? Is that to say that I haven't done 75 or I haven't done 90? No. But there is a point where you're so fatigued, you're so exhausted, you're so run down that chance of injury exponentially increases. And I think that's where we have to be very honest, is like with these harder forms of cardio that are more systemically fatiguing, doing 90 minutes. I mean, like even doing 90 minutes just walking at a high incline at a moderate rate, it's not ideal. And really what I would ask yourself is like, is what you're doing something that if you did for the next 3 months, 5 months, would it lead you to be in a better place or a worse place? And I think for most people, in the case where they're doing, a tremendous amount of cardio, 60, 90 minutes per session, 6, 7 days a week, you got to think it's like, okay, well, why is this amount of cardio needed? And I mean, even before that, is it needed? So I kind of think about it like this. For simplicity, if you were to do 60 minutes on the stairs, for most people, that's going to burn about 500 calories. So realistically, if you do not change your diet and you just do that in theory could result in a 1 pound rate of loss per week. But is that sustainable? No. Is that something that in a mini cut could make sense? Perhaps. But realistically, if you're committing to a 4, a 6, an 8 week, a 12 week, 16 week diet, and you're going in thinking, I'm going to do this every day for just, this hard 12 weeks or whatever, realistically, there's going to be a point where that chance of injury gets higher and higher. And if it worked, I would potentially find application for it. But realistically, I've seen a lot of people try to do models like this where they just do a shitload of cardio just out the gate and they try to sustain that the entirety of their fat loss phase or their prep. And 9 out of 10 times, yes, there's always an exception. But for a lot of people, this results in them being in a worse place because A, their training performance is down, meaning that they're probably not retaining the tissue that they were hoping for. If composition or physique is like at all a part of your priority and why you're losing fat, why you're doing cardio, you have to consider the fact that like if you lose muscle, you're making your job harder because it's like if the goal is to lose 10 pounds, there's an implication that like you're trying to maintain the same amount of muscle because if you lose muscle, now to achieve that same look that you could have got if you just lost 10 pounds, you're probably going to have to lose more because now you have less foundation, you have less muscle pushing against the skin. And that's where we really have to consider, is cardio aiding in the fat loss phase or is it creating additional work by now causing us to lose tissue? Now, the other part to this is like the actual catabolism, the tissue loss, but then there's the aspect that it's going to make it harder to adhere to the training program and uphold training performance. And if you're unfamiliar with training performance and progressive overload and how that fits into a fat loss phase, I would highly recommend going and looking at the other video I did on training terminology made simple, where I go through all of these terms like in a very like plain speak way. Now, there's that aspect. So there's cannibalism, there's the impact on training performance, then there's the impact on recovery that we can't overlook. And really, in the case where you are spreading yourself so thin because maybe you're trying to get in these 60-minute sessions every single day, well, realistically, if you're doing those on top of your weightlifting session, it's a long time spent at the gym. But even if you're splitting it up, it's like, unless you have very minimal responsibilities, it's probably going to impact your schedule and your stress levels around your schedule, because now you have this, hour and a half to 2 hour block of the day, depending on your commute, where you have to go do cardio. So realistically, I also consider that as well as like the feasibility of maintaining the kind of schedule needs. And sure, if you have a treadmill at home, maybe we ditch the commute, but it's still a big portion of your week. At that point, it's almost like a part-time job. And last thing I'll say about like doing too much cardio is I see people try to structure in a way like, well, I'm not going to bring my food too low. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to raise my cardio to a point. It's like, yeah, but if we're like abiding by the rule of even like 60 minutes, 7 days a week, that's so much cardio. That's way too much. And in a short spurt, maybe it could make sense. Maybe there's an argument for it. But long term, that's not where you want to be. And realistically, what I would say is like, you might be able to recover better and more if you bring the cardio down and bring food down simultaneously to support that continued deficit. But I've played that game before. I wouldn't recommend exclusively creating your deficit through cardio. Now, the other way that doing the wrong amount of cardio can bite you in the ass is doing too little cardio. So everything that I just laid out is like creating that deficit, through a balance of cardio and diet. Now, I'll have people on the other side be like, I don't like cardio, so why don't I just lower food? Like, I'll go down to 1,000 calories, I'll go down to 1,100. And I'm like, it's still not a lot of food. And even then, there's going to be some discrepancy in like how low we can go with like your amount of food. It's like, if we start at 1,100, it's like, where are we going to go from here? Like, I'm not putting you to 900. And I kind of see cardio in that regard as like, hey, this is a vessel to allow us to facilitate more fat loss and create some of that deficit without putting you in a position where hunger signaling is going to go through the roof. And realistically, if you're on that kind of diet, 1,000 calories, 1,200 calories for an extended period of time, there's going to likely be issues with adherence. Sure, there are ways to modulate that, but for most people, naturally, they're not going to be able to adhere to that kind of diet long term. It's hard to come up with like an exact amount or even an amount of cardio to start at. But personally, I like giving clients weekly totals instead of saying do 30 minutes 5 times a week. I would rather someone have the autonomy to plug it into their schedule where it makes the most sense, because I can tell you, like, I've had people who they've worked with stricter coaches, they worked with coaches who have like very just wild like regard, or I guess like a lack of regard for their schedule and what they have going on outside of fitness. And realistically, yes, it is a commitment and there's sacrifice involved here. But I do think that I've had a lot of success plugging in cardio in a way that complements my schedule. And I think for individuals who work, who have kids, who are in school, I think it's important to have that freedom, because then they can also learn what are good decisions and what are good formats for their cardio and what formats are not as successful. Now, I want to go back because I realized I didn't talk about this, but I think this example will be really enlightening for a lot of you. Now, in today's day and age, like, we have access to a lot of these like at-home devices, and there are very affordable like walking pads or little like at-home treadmills that they kind of function as a treadmill, but they're more so passive steps. And with this, these can be really beneficial, and these are a great way to increase overall activity. But this is where I think heart rate is something that we really have to consider relative to defining structured cardio versus passive cardio. And passive cardio, I don't really call steps that, but I guess, like in this example, like you could refer to them that way. They're non-exercise, but they are activity. So, historically, this has been something people refer to as NEAT, so non-exercise activity. Genesis. And within that, it's like you can say that step count, I guess, how should I put this? I've had a lot of success with organizing step count in a way so that it doesn't go down in a prep. I do think that there's a point where it's like just assigning 15,000 to 20,000 steps a day in addition to structured cardio also can be detrimental. And that just comes from the practicality of like getting in that amount of steps. And I've had a client who recently, like we were talking and she's like, yeah, like I do a portion of my structured cardio, because I was asking like with her schedule with school, I'm like, how does this work with doing like 280 minutes of cardio? That's a lot. She's like, well, I do a big portion while I'm studying. And this was like a couple weeks after making that bump into her cardio. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And she's like, well, I do the structured cardio on the walking pad. And I'm like, what, can you describe that to me? Like, how intense is that cardio as opposed to when you're at the gym? And this was really like a learning opportunity for both me and her, because I'm like, I need to specify like, hey, just because you have a walking pad, like that doesn't necessarily count as structured cardio. Like, yes, it will get your heart rate kind of up potentially, but like, I'll tell you, I had a treadmill in my last apartment doing schoolwork on the computer or reading a book or on my phone. If I was doing anything that required a ton of engagement, which, like, to be fair, like that does vary person to person, but in the case that you were just walking passively at a very low speed at no incline, that is likely not going to be the same kind of cardio, the same kind of intensity that you would achieve at, let's say, a 5 to 10% incline at 3.5 miles an hour on a treadmill. Now, listen, like I know some of y'all are like, hey, I work doing the Stairmaster, or like I get it. And Stairmaster actually is a great way. Like I find a lot of peace of mind, like doing work while on it. But this also comes down to, what are we defining as cardio? What are we defining as like intense cardio, structured cardio, passive cardio? And what are we counting towards that? And how does this translate into the progress, or really the deficit that we're trying to create? In the case that someone is like, yeah, I do exactly that, and I don't see issues on the scale. I'm happy with the rate of loss and I'm losing at the target rate. Sick. I'm not going to say much about that because it's working. In the case where someone's not losing as quickly, that's where I'm going to be like, hey, we need to have continuity in your forms of cardio. And this also reminds me of a different client I had, where first couple weeks, like working together, and like I assigned her, I think it was 180 minutes. So it's still a good amount of cardio. And she went from elliptical to recumbent bike to hiking to jogging as her forms. And I was like, okay, like it's cool that you have variability and like great for your peace of mind. But realistically, like these are not going to burn the same amount of calories session to session. So like we don't have uniformity in how we're tracking your cardio, your output. And that can be a problem. And I mean, y'all know where I'm going with this. Obviously she wasn't losing at the same rate, and like there were other reasons like with her diet, but that was something I kind of brought up to her attention. I'm like, hey, we need to be mindful of this, because this will impact your ability to have consistency in your deficit. And if you're unhappy with the rate of loss, this is very low hanging fruit for us to adjust now.